list of panelists and folks who are going to have this conversation with us. First among them, who I'd love to introduce to you now, is Steve Orrin. Steve Orrin is the federal CTO for the Intel Corporation, and he will be hosting our panels today. And Steve, if you could join me, I'd love to. Well, hi, Steve. Very nice to see you. If you could tell us about, we've got two great panels and a show corner for you today. So would you like to talk about the first panel first?
Absolutely. Thank you, Karen, and great to be here today. We've got an exciting show we've put together, starting off with our first panel, where we'll be discussing the potential for AI to be useful to society in general, but we'll be taking a closer look at where the possibilities for AI to either be misused or often even abused if not properly handled. Our primary area of focus and question will be, in this part of the show, will be really, how can AI become biased or be biased intrinsically, and how that manifests itself in the real world? We'll look at some of the social implications of using AI in situations that previously were the domain of human judgment, and how this is being deployed and spreading to encompass more decision-making processes. From there, we'll transition into our exciting show corner, where we'll be talking about how the use of AI in the health sector, when deployed with the best intentions, can go bad. And then finally, we'll be ending with the second panel, where we'll start to look at how we to ensure an ethical approach to the development and deployment of artificial intelligence, and how should we go about securing these AI systems and the methods of embedding ethics throughout the AI lifecycle. We'll also touch on some of the social institutional approaches that are either currently being applied or looked at, and really where the industry and we as a society should be going when it comes to approaching ethical AI.
That sounds like such a wonderful way to frame the conversation. Gadi had asked me a week ago to join a panel on AI and ethics, and I said, I don't know, I'm an AI curmudgeon. There are so many issues with it, and it's really great to focus. I think just a wonderful way of structuring the conversation to break it into those components and really separate them out. So thank you so much. With that, do you want to introduce your first panelists and take it away?
Absolutely. So I'd like to start off by introducing Dr. Jim Short, who is the research director and lead scientist and co-founder for the Center for Large-Scale Data Systems at San Diego Supercomputer Center. He studies the economic, business, and adoption and social impacts of new technologies, and received his undergraduate and graduate degrees from MIT. Dr. Short will be our moderator, and we'll introduce the first panel today. So, Jim, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve, and thank you everyone for joining today. It's a pleasure to introduce our panelists. We have four experts that are going to join our panel today. Choi Autio is the AI policy lead for Intel. She's a proud Montanan and is currently based in Washington, D.C. Choi works closely with academic researchers and business leads in helping to shape policies and practices in emerging technologies. She did her work at UC Berkeley out here in California in economics. Joey, you want to just wave so that people, no, okay, we're on just me, yep. Dr. Andrew Harding is a senior policy and technology advisor working at the UK's Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. He's helping to develop robust governance for AI and data-driven technologies. Dr. Harding is also honored to be a trustee for London's Coway Hall Ethical Society. Tamara Zubatiy is CEO and founder of startup VeriCrypt. VeriCrypt is an AI tech-based company based in Atlanta, Georgia. Her company uses AI-based text scoring to help news producers and readers flag bias. She's currently a PhD student in computer science and human-centered computing at Georgia Tech. And Steve, who was introduced earlier, is, of course, the CTO and federal CTO at Intel. Steve was also named, I'll just note, his long list of accomplishments include being named one of InfoWorld's top 25 CTOs a number of years ago. He's also a guest researcher, as one of his specialty areas is in security, and he works with NIST and their Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. So, okay, everyone, welcome to this, our distinguished panel, everyone joining us today. Off we go. So Steve, I'd like to turn to you first. Our subject today is AI and ethics. Lots are being written about this. Lots of information on the airwaves now, everything from Siri and smart TVs that listen into you when they're not supposed to election meddling in an upcoming election here in the United States. Can you start us off and give us some examples, some tangible examples of what we mean by everything about AI is interesting, it's around us, and we're trying to develop it?
Thank you, Jim. And really what we're seeing is AI has permeated every part of everyday life. To examples like you mentioned, like Siri and other digital assistants, to autonomous vehicles or semi-autonomous vehicles that are using AI to navigate the roads, to the apps that you use to drive to be able to navigate and find where the least traffic is or what's the fastest way to get to a certain location, are all using AI in everyday life. We're seeing in the news, people talk about both good and bad uses of AI. I think last couple of years, the Cambridge Analytica use case could show where AI and targeting that can be done on social media AI can go horribly wrong fairly quickly. But I think what's important to recognize is that AI is here. This notion that it's coming, it's already here, and it's part of our everyday life. We don't necessarily always recognize it, but anyone who's used their face to unlock their iPhone is using AI. That facial recognition is AI. Anyone who's got a Roomba automated vacuum cleaner in their house, it's using AI to navigate through your house and find the best possible way to clean the house without running into obstacles. So we're seeing AIs being used everywhere. But there are cases where we've seen where either through intentional use or just mistakes made along the way, AI can go horribly wrong. There was an example a few years ago of where an organization used AI to train systems in order to be able to do better recommendations around hiring practices and be able to find, weed through candidates more quickly. But their training set they used in order to get there was predominantly male. And so the AI was biased against female coders and female software engineers because the AI wasn't trained properly. And so in what was potentially supposed to be a really good use case to help weed out and get to good candidates, it was very skewed. And it was skewed from the get-go. And we see that happen over and over again, where AIs, even for the best intentions, because of lack of training sets or mistakes made along the way, they can go horribly, horribly wrong. At the same time, AI is a tool, and that tool can be used for good or for bad. And so we have to keep in mind that it is like a hammer, and you can use that to bang a nail and build a house, or you can use it to destroy. And I think we're seeing AI be used in both of those cases. But I want to sort of, for the purpose of today, I think Tesla is a great example of what AI can do. It's got multiple sensors doing facial object recognition, change detection, navigation, and so forth. It all come together to be able to give you that driving experience. But also built in there are questions about what happens when it needs to stop suddenly or take control, or when it needs to decide which direction to go if there's an obstacle in the way. There's some really challenging decisions that need to be made by the AI there.
Okay, thank you, Steve. I think that, so Dr. Harding, let's move to the policy domain. You've been providing insight and guidance in your center to the UK government. That brings us an international perspective on how you've been looking at it. Can you follow Steve and sort of talk a little bit about what you've been doing in your center in the UK?
Of course, I'd be more than happy to. We've been pretty busy. We've been formed now for not a terribly long time, but a bit over a year, coming to our kind of second year of operation, I think. I've been there for about the last 9 months, but prior to that, we've released a lot of work, and during my tenure, we've released a lot of work. We have snapshot papers into deepfakes, into AI and insurance, into smart speakers. We've convened roundtables to discuss the way policing and AI can interact and can be used. We've reviewed online targeting and the way that functions across social media platforms. We've got briefing papers on things like facial recognition technology and online targeting. Really, kind of the list goes on. I think at the moment we've got two big things that are really worth mentioning. One of which is a thing called the AI Barometer, which lists opportunities, risks, and kind of governance challenges in the way AI and data works. And the other one we've got is a thing called the COVID repository, which I no doubt we'll talk about COVID later on in this chat. But it looks at the different ways local authorities in the UK have been dealing with those problems.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Harding. Chloe, let's continue on a discussion here of the kind of policy domain. Your role at Intel has the word policy in it. You're the lead policy person. So can you provide a perspective on how you are advising and developing corporate policies?
Yeah, so thanks so much all for setting us up and for Gadi and Karen having me here. I think mostly what I do at Intel is work to, I think, anticipate and understand where public policy is going and help Intel figure out what we need to do, not only to comply, not only to understand what's going on with policy, but make sure that we're building and designing technologies that will usher in and protect this new technology. As Steve said, there's a lot going on with AI. It's definitely here. But with any technology, it can be used for good or ill. And in the policy group and then throughout Intel, we really want to make sure that we're building AI, we're working with customers who are building other AI applications in a way that is ethical, responsible, tries to address these issues of bias and discrimination that we see creeping in with AI systems. And so, I'm really excited to be here, not only to talk a little more about that and dive in, but also hear about, all of these other different organizations, be they business like Tamara's or research focused like we have with Dr. Harding, as well as, the research institution that you're at, Dr. Short, and, see how really across the industry and across, so many segments of society, people are thinking about how to adopt and approach AI in a way that is safe and responsible. So really excited to be here today and happy to continue the conversation about what we're doing at Intel.
Great. Thank you very much, Chloe. So let's turn to someone kind of at the, what we could consider to be ground zero at this, which is Tamara and Zubatiy, who's in a startup company, VeriCrypt, who's involved in developing an AI-focused activity, a series of algorithmic development in the area of news bias, a much discussed topic in the news today, certainly in an election cycle. So Tamara, can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing and how it's going?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. Jim, thank you so much for the introduction. VeriCrypt is a technology company, and we use, just like Jim said, AI techniques, so machine learning, to score bias in the news. And so I have to be clear here, I'm talking about human bias that exists in the news. I'm not talking about algorithmic bias. That is something that we have to deal with. But what VeriCrypt actually scores is the different cognitive biases that come through in the language of the writing that we use to convey the news. And so this is a really difficult problem right now because all of these different news providers are writing different content, and all of the content has different biases. And on the other side of that, there's all of these readers, and each reader has his or her own biases. And so it's really an interesting time. And so the people who kind of use VeriCrypt are news providers and also news readers and people who have to make difficult decisions based on the news. So news providers can kind of score their content as they're writing it and obtain kind of quick and actionable feedback about how biased the content is, how colloquial the language is, and how sensational the language is. But also, you can think kind of on a broader scale, like if you're an intelligence group or something and you're processing lots of information to inform decisions, or maybe you're investing and you're processing lots of news to inform an investment, then it's critical for you to get the most accurate and the least biased information. And so our goal at VeriCrypt is to provide data intelligence on this news so that people at the end of the day can ultimately make better and more informed decisions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Tamara. So we're in this discussion about AI and ethics, and part of what we want to do is to introduce the scope of AI. Steve, let me throw it to you and to maybe discuss a little bit about how much of a history we're looking at right now. Some people would describe the history of AI as 50 years old, going all the way back to Turing and some of the other activities. There has been a long cycle of development in the area of expert systems. Some people would point to that in the 1980s, thinking machines, other companies in that space. Where in the space are we thinking for our discussion today about AI history? Where are we cutting into it?
So, Jim, you make a very valid point. AI has been around for a long time. You can almost think back to things like Alan Turing and the Turing test and some of the early work in AI. And there have been examples of AI applied throughout history as applied along the same lines as computer science. I think some of the key things that have happened in the last 10 years and even the last couple is computing has finally caught up with the math. And so our ability to perform these AI functions at speed and at scale, to train AIs quickly enough to actually get the value, and to have the various different compute architectures we're seeing to apply to the AI problems, we are now finally at the point where the AIs are actually starting to be able to provide those benefits at scale. I think the other thing that's going in tandem with AI is the data revolution. The sheer volume of data that's being generated day after day, minute after minute, year after year, is doubling the size of the data that we had the year before. Data drives AI. It is part of the training sets that we use to train those models and create those algorithms. And then it's what the AI is pointing at and looking at and trying to discern intelligence and information out of. And so I think the computing catching up with the math and just having the sheer volume of data to apply to the problem is giving rise to the AI revolution that we're living in right now. And it's happening at a huge speed. The rate at which AI is evolving, new algorithms, new techniques are coming up every couple of days. We're seeing the math being refined. And then we see things like next generation compute architectures. People know about quantum coming. What do people are starting to figure out is, what does quantum mean for an AI? What does neuromorphic computing mean for an AI? What does having GPUs and CPUs working together do for AI? These technological evolutions, while very technical in nature, are spearheading the next generation of growth of AI. So I think we're at the very beginning of that next launch of the evolution of AI. But we're standing on the shoulders of greatness for the last 40 years that have been building some of the math and foundations upon which we're building from.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve. Dr. Harding, we were mentioning Alan Turing here in our discussion, which of course is entirely something we should be doing. Maybe you can give us a little sense of how, in your advice in your own center, Steve has identified kind of a lot of current challenges, and we're gonna move to that here in a second. Can you bring us forward a little bit from the history that you've been looking at in terms of some of the current challenges you're looking at right now in your own center?
Sure, I think I've understood that question. This isn't the first time we've had one of these big artificial intelligence revolutions. This is like the fourth or the fifth. And they're generally called AI winters and AI summers when you have less interest and more interest. And the reasons for the winters and the summers are varied, but very interesting. And they're often economic as much as they are technological. So we find ourselves, as Steve says, not just in a position now where we've got all of this data and all this compute power, but where kind of the economic circumstances and the political circumstances are such that we want to embrace those things and we want to solve grand societal challenges with the means of that technology. Previously, we've been in places where we've had like a really big burst in technological development, but then the money's run out, or we've had a situation where there's been a lot of hype about what could be achieved, and then the technology hasn't quite managed to achieve those goals, and then the interest has waned again. But now we're in the situation where, although there's still no small degree of hype, a lot of the things that are being talked about are also being achieved. And that means that we're in kind of full implementation space. We're very much coming with grand ideas, trying to solve big problems, and we have at least the beginnings of the technology that will allow us to do those things. It does mean that we're in very much kind of experimental phase in many ways, and we really do need good governance to make sure that we make good choices and we deploy tools in responsible and reliable ways.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Dr. Harding. Chloe, I'd like to throw this to you in the context of how companies are developing partnerships and thinking about the question of developing this notion of ethical uses in terms of where you see you cutting into kind of this AI tech evolution. You have that in your title, so I'd like you to comment on how you've been developing that as a pattern of thinking at your company.
Sure. So I think as we're all familiar, maybe some of us, there's the conversation around AI and ethics, or what is ethical AI, right? Has been around maybe for, a long time, but in recent years, maybe the past 3 to 5 years, in a lot of these events, like Steve mentioned, incidents of autonomy or technology misuse going awfully wrong. We've seen this, surge in criticism and scrutiny of the technology industry when it comes to AI and data and what's going on with emerging technologies. And that's sort of been framed, right, as AI ethics, but I'm actually not enamored with that term because I don't think that it fully encompasses all of the things that we're dealing with and that we need to be thinking about and talking about when it comes to AI ethics. So beyond ethics, which, Dr. Harding and other folks on the phone here can definitely attest, is a really complicated, thorny topic, right? I'm not an ethicist. There are a lot of great ethicists in the world, but it is a very, in many cultures and societies, hypothetical and varied framework by which to think about something as complex as artificial intelligence and a new technology, a new anything, really. So at Intel, and I think throughout the technology industry as a whole, we've really tried to think about what we call AI ethics more from corporate responsibility or a corporate responsibility point of view, as well as an issue of, compliance. Is this safe? Is it reliable? Does it protect privacy and security? Things that we can sort of more meaningfully control, or at least try to control in the space of new technologies. So when I think about AI ethics, I really think about, responsible AI. Is the technology responsible? Is it being deployed equitably? Are we thinking about human rights in the context in which these technologies are deployed? So I think it really goes, farther beyond ethics. And while, the industry, civil society, governments around the world are still really trying to figure this out, right? How to regulate AI. I think approaching it from a point of view of, responsibility and accountability is a much better way to think about it rather than, is this or is this not ethical?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Chloe. I'd like to introduce one of our interactive chat questions that we've been prompted with. We'll move to the security issues in a second here, but there's a question that is, I think we're all looking at, which is around the notion that someone has advised that they were concerned by the notion that IA bias and outrooting. And the question is how does artificial intelligence or AI distinguish between humor and fact? I mean, how are we supposed to be addressing that question? And there's a concept of some, is this Big Brother, like streamlining of thought and expression? So Tamara, I'm going to throw that to you because it's part of kind of what you're trying to develop as an AI, and then we'll go around the room here because I think this is one of the questions that we're all working on and struggling with, which is how do we distinguish exactly as this person is asking, conversational language, which is part of normal discourse, and things that are not conversational. That we have regulations and indeed some court decisions on what is language that is considered conversational. So Tamara, why don't you take that one on, and we'll go around the room. Let's get everybody's comment on that.
It's quite a big question there, Jim, but I'll give it my best shot. I'd kind of like to preface the discussion by saying that the information ecosystem that we live in today isn't the same one that we lived in 20 years ago. And it's pretty safe to say that we live in a weaponized information system now, where you as an individual, when you're exploring the webs, the content that you're reading is very likely to be targeted for you and designed to manipulate your emotions or your behavior in one way or another. If not to convince you to buy something, then maybe to convince you to go visit for another page or to vote for somebody, or literally whatever it may be. So as we have to kind of take a step back and change the way in which we're approaching the way in which we intake information, and think about it more from like a defensive perspective. So like, what are our strategies for cognitive defense in this information overload kind of an ecosystem? And so when it comes to humor versus fact, like, I don't want to linger on like too many of the semantics here, but there's a point at which humor can be detrimental too. And like, you can bring up The Onion, for example, as we're getting to a point in regular news where it's hard to tell if it's an Onion article or an actual news headline. And that's really troubling. Like, in my opinion, taking a step back, we don't do veracity, so we're not a fact-checking service. We can assist with people who are doing fact-checking, but that's not really what we do. But what's interesting is that when you think about what is the facts about something, if you take any situation, there's always multiple facts, and different people identify with certain facts more than they do with others. And so it's really hard to say, like, in one situation, the truth can mean different things to different people. And so that's really one of the biggest challenges of working on this problem. But I do feel like there's certain tools that we kind of have at our disposal, such as like, what are our consensus as a culture definitions of what is factual? And so maybe we can look at dictionaries or encyclopedias as like examples of that. But beyond that, you're right, and that's a really astute question, and that it does get really fuzzy, and especially when you add in the intentions of the people who are generating the content, or worse, sometimes it's not even people, it's just a botnet that's propagating that content. So it really is a really nuanced thing that we're trying to tackle.
So thank you, Tamara. It is a difficult question, and I think you've started us off. Dr. Harding, you're in a culture that has Speaker's Corner and kind of addressed this topic for a very long time. How do you react to this?
I've got two responses. One of them is very much to do with my culture, and the other one less so. So the first one is that I think humor is a great defense in these circumstances. I would say that, but British culture is famed for running on unspoken kind of convention. And folks who move here from elsewhere often find it difficult to pick up on nuanced conversation. We're famous for not quite meaning what we say, and so on and so forth. But if you look at the output of aforementioned botnets, they're very rarely funny. And if you look at how AI-generated content appears, it's normally very earnest and very direct. And part of that's because of what it's trying to do, because you've normally got an aim, you've normally got a target you're trying to approach or something you're trying to do. And humor doesn't work like that in most circumstances. It's circuitous, it works to different agendas. So one of the ways that you can often tell if a tweet is, or some other form of media is generated by a person or a robot, is if it's funny. So first of all, I'd just like to say that at least for now, like, human humor is a great way of fact-checking things. Although I have no doubt that AI could generate Onion articles, I don't think they'd be as successful as those generated by the people who write them. So that's thing number one. Thing number two is this subject of truth that Tamara raises is really interesting, and the way it's changed over time is really interesting. We've moved from radio broadcast, which is very much kind of one-to-many, where there is a definable truth that is being produced by an actor for an end, to television, where you have multiple channels of these truths, but still some small number of actors to large-scale output, to now this profusion, this absolute constellation of information that's out there. And that alone isn't enough to do what I'm about to say, but other things have happened where we have had this corrosion of what is reliable and where people want information from, and it winds up with you in this position where everyone takes off in completely different trajectories. So there's no agreed position, there's no agreed truth, and we've found over the last probably decade that facts alone won't cut it. That what people consider to be true is multifaceted, multivaried, and as we get more automated content generated for different ends, I only see that increasing. And that's kind of a problem we're going to have to figure out how to face, and something that I hope people like Tamara will be able to help us with.
Thank you, Dr. Harding. Let's put this in the context of Chloe. You identified early on that you were not enamored with the term ethics as applied to AI in the context of the responsibility and accountability for who is developing and who is kind of deploying for actual use. Could you comment on your thoughts on how this notion that we've been discussing, which is around actual deployment and kind of the identification of where in this cycle of evolution of AI we sit right now in terms of being able to test some of this stuff out?
Sure. So first of all, I loved all of what my fellow panelists had to say here. But I think to alleviate some pressure from Tamara and to get back to your question about ethics and why I don't think we thinking about solutions in terms of ethics is the best way to do it is because these are really what we're seeing here: issues of truth, issues of uncertainty, issues of being able to trust the validity of content and when it's coming at you from so many different sources, right? These are societal problems that sometimes can require technical fixes and solutions or, be solved by technical fixes and solutions. But oftentimes, just having a bias mitigating toolkit or a fact-checking algorithm is not going to be enough to fix and solve the many problems of the world, right? Issues of human rights, of societal bias that gets programmed, or hate speech that people are saying in different languages and contexts and cultures that then gets translated into what someone.
Okay, let me get, I think we have a little bit of an interruption. Let me continue this discussion, and before we switch off of it, we had a mention in the chat line again about a specific question that would be addressed in the use of AI to screen people for an HR, for an application, for job listing, for example. That's a very specific use case, but it illuminates the general question about how it's used. So, Dr. Harding, have you looked at that area specifically in your center, and could you comment on it?
I absolutely can. So we have a forthcoming report on algorithmic bias that looks at these kinds of questions. It's not published yet. I should let you folks know when it is. But there's a really interesting point here, and it speaks back to what Steve was talking about earlier when we talk about having all of this data that we have now that we didn't have previously. We're at a moment in time where we're encoding all of these choices and all of these strategies into automated or kind of machine-built strategies, and it kind of behooves us to inspect them and to see what they're doing and to try and figure out if they're appropriate or not. So we have all of this data, and we're trying to make systems that make good decisions. So we have the potential to both kind of address biases, which is what the question asks, but also reveal them, which is something which goes beyond that. So we have all this information. We can look at an organization and say, well, is their hiring biased? And, do we want to do something about that? And do we now have the data that will allow that to happen? So it's really interesting. The choices then are, do we want to replicate our processes of the past when we automate things, or do we want to do better than that? And hopefully the data will let us do better.
All right, thank you very much, Andrew. Let's set this topic down for a moment, and let's move to a second area that we wanted to cover in the discussion, which is around the relationship between AI and security policies. There's often a little bit, and what I read, and from the background, my background in this area, there's a bit of disconnect between whether people are talking about privacy and security and AI and the kind of interaction effect between those. Steve, you spent a lot of years looking at cybersecurity and thoughts about where security cuts into this interaction. Can you talk a little bit about how you've looked at it and where it fits in your thinking?
Thank you, Jim. I think one of the things to think about is that when I think about AI and security, number one, you have to think about on two sides of the coin. So let's start with the obvious one. This is how do we secure AI systems? And we need to we need to secure the AI throughout its entire life cycle. Because AIs, as we start to make more important decisions based on the outputs and results of AI, we need to be able to trust that the AI itself is giving us the best answer and that it itself has not been coerced or been tricked into giving us false information. And there are many examples on the internet that you can go search for around where AI has been targeted and attacked, both demonstrations at conferences as well as real world, whether it be poison data or understanding how the algorithm works and then creating pictures that can give false reads. But also when it gets a little bit more nefarious is when they go in and they start poisoning data sets, or people start swapping out algorithms mid-life cycle and changing things or purposely skewing things so that they can get away with whether it be recommendation systems or facial recognition and the like. So on one hand, we got to look at how do we secure the AI systems? How do we trust that data sets have integrity, that the models are being protected throughout their life cycle, and that the feedback learning, we're getting the actual real-world information we're getting. On the flip side, we also need to look at how can we leverage this great technology of AI machine learning and apply it to security and apply it to AI, AI watching AI. One of the interesting areas of research right now that's really hot is this notion of adversarial networks. And it's a subsection of AI, and it's where you basically have different AIs attacking each other. And we've seen some great examples of it in use. The DARPA Grand Challenge from a few years ago, where they had these different AI bots, and the goal was you'd have adversaries and you had protectors, and they launched them against each other, where the adversaries were trying to hack into each other, and then the defenders were trying to defend and close the holes that were being found. And it was a really exciting thing to see these autonomous systems go at each other with AI. We're seeing this in deep fakes, where you use adversarial network technologies to create fully fake videos and fake audio. And so one of the things that AI can do is can help us to spot those fakes or help us to see where AIs may be not going according to plan. But at the same time, I think we also have to recognize that humans are involved in AI. Everyone thinks, oh, AI is this magic robot that's going to do good or bad things. We build the AIs. We design the AIs. We train the AIs. And so when we talk about whether it be the human resource question you were talking about earlier or other natural language processing or facial recognition use cases, ultimately a lot of the design flaws start with either human error or just the humans not designing correctly for what the outcomes they were looking for. And it might be limited data sets, not doing a good enough job of having diversity in those data sets, or rushing to get data, getting AIs out the door without completing the process and getting that good feedback training and human intervention training, just going with something unsupervised. So we see a lot of examples where we get AIs that do terrible things or give us really bad outcomes. And it's not because the AI is necessarily intrinsically flawed or bad. There's no evil AI. It's really where humans are involved in the development and design have either skipped steps or rushed things or haven't really thought through the overall architecture. And we have to, again, apply cybersecurity policy and risk mitigation to make sure that we can better trust these AI systems as we start making more and more important decisions using AI.
Okay, thank you, Steve. So we're raising questions kind of about we're circulating around a little bit of what we've been discussing in terms of how these systems are designed, how they're deployed, and who uses them. This current discussion recalls Tamara and your presentation around kind of your system. How are you related? Where are you in the context of thinking about the security of your system and your system picking up other AI systems that are looking at you as you look at them? How does that work in your mind?
Yeah, I feel like there's kind of two sides to it. The first side is like, how do we make sure that our models are reliable? And then the second side of it is kind of how do we protect ourselves from people that might want to misuse the technology or use the technology in different ways, or even like use the same, like we're trying to remove bias, but maybe people will try to kind of hack at it and try to find ways that they can express themselves that it's still biased, but kind of missing the things that our AI is looking for. So we have to be really aware of the insights that our AI is generating so that we can see if other people are trying to kind of bypass the rules. But also, I feel like it's really important to think about like what we do is essentially the inverse of SEO. So search engine optimization is just like making things more biased. And so in a not ideal world, people could misuse our technology and make content that's even more manipulative. And so we think that that's our responsibility as the company that's creating this technology. So something that we've been kind of always building into our ideas and into our technology is kind of technical enforcement of these ethical concepts. So say you're writing an article and you're trying to make it less biased, or you claim that you're trying to make it less biased, but you keep submitting it in through VeriCrypt to get it scored, and then suddenly your bias ratings go up through the roof. We kind of have a couple options there. We could just proceed and not do anything, or we could let you know and we could tell you like your content is increasing in bias. We could notify your supervisor. There's all sorts of kind of social systems and beyond just the technical enforcement, but also like social enforcement of how to be accountable for this content that you're releasing. And it really is really challenging because a lot of the content that's released, we don't have accountability for, because when the content comes out, it's like it's bot generated, like we've been discussing, and it's tailored for people's specific ad profiles. But if you go later into, you try to find that same article, there's only one version of it. And like, good luck if you could even find the exact same version that you read. And so there's no way for them to be accountable for all of those versions that just vanished into the internet. So it's really a difficult problem. And from the security point of view, we kind of have to be hyper vigilant about it all the time, starting from our data sets and then continuing on through managing the way in which people use our product. So Steve, to echo what you're saying, it really is like a full life cycle management process to make that happen.
Yeah, I think that this is exactly where we're talking about this question of bias. We're talking about how you design these algorithms that are going to kind of learn as they go along with increasing precision about the assumptions and the rule sets in them. Dr. Harding, you've thought about the question of bias in the UK context for a long time. Can you continue this discussion and let us know your perspective on it?
Yeah, gladly. So I want to pick up something Steve said earlier and kind of spin it a little bit. So he was mentioning how, like, often we as humans will shuffle AI out the door, and various things that we've done will make it act poorly. But the reverse is essentially true, where if we rely entirely on a machine-based decision, we're in trouble. So there's a lot of things in legislation around when and where and how you should include people in decision making, and for what purposes and reasons. And essentially, it's if something is important to someone or someone's agency, you should have a person involved. And the reason for that is because of what machines are good and not good at. So they don't have context, they don't have nuance, and it can be very difficult to encode things that we take for granted. So human concept of fairness is something that's very difficult to encode in a machine, despite there being a huge academic literature on doing exactly that thing. Even if you're in something quite relatively simple, like the law, UK law for discrimination is very different from US law for discrimination. So US law revolves around a thing called the 4/5 rule, which has a metric for how much bias is acceptable. And in UK, we don't have that concept. So if you developed a tool in the US to try and make a system more fair, less biased, and then deployed it in the UK, legally, you'd be in a really weird position, and it might not even pass those tests. So having people involved in these processes when decisions are made is really important and really key.
Indeed. Thank you. Thank you, Doctor. Chloe, we're glad to see you got back.
Sorry, everyone. Yes.
Can you pick up on this, and then we'll continue the discussion?
Yeah, in fact, I'll just piggyback off what Dr. Harding Andrew just said about having people involved. I think that's something we've been talking about from the beginning, but I think that what's becoming really, really important in this, particularly for the discussions around bias and discrimination, is not just having people involved and, addressing these issues in a way that is not just technical fixes, right? But not only having people involved, but having the right people involved. And that doesn't just mean, engineers and designers and business operations managers. It means actually having, folks from corporate responsibility, social scientists, economists, ethnographers, statisticians, sometimes even psychologists, people who, and of course, people who, are not only representative of many different educational backgrounds and experiences, but also life experiences. So socioeconomic backgrounds, diversity in race and gender, sexual orientation. We've seen so many issues of bias being a real problem because technologies are not working or serving people because of the color of their skin, where they came from, their ability to access capital, all these types of things. And so making sure that we have the right people in the room, the right people being consulted on certain decisions is incredibly important. And I'm really proud to say that this is actually something that we're doing at Intel, and that a lot of members in the tech community are actually being very proactive about. We always need more. As we all know, especially in the U.S. these days, diversity is incredibly important, and within the tech industry, the same goes. So having that diversity of thought, having that diversity of background and experience is a complete positive and makes your products and solutions better because they're more accessible and more knowledgeable to a wider set of people. So it's not just an issue of, how do we prevent bias? It really is a net positive for whatever you're trying to do. Whether that's, write a paper, build a solution, create a tool. Having the right people in the room to consult and ask questions and to raise issues is so key when we're having this conversation about bias and how to prevent it, especially in artificial intelligence.
Okay, thank you very much, Chloe. So we have about 20 minutes remaining in our first panel, and I'd like to move to a third topic, which we see often described in the general press in various ways, but it's around the notion of explainable AI, and there's this concept of transparency. That kind of implies explainable to whom, transparent to whom. Is this a technical domain, and it's that those people who explain it to a general audience, or is this to general people explain it to general people of any area of expertise? So Steve, I'm going to throw this back to you to kind of set it up, and then we'll get everyone's view on this, on what is explainable AI. Over to you.
Thank you. And so I think those two terms are actually pretty loaded here. I want to separate them. So I would separate transparent AI from explainable AI. And let's start with transparent. The way I think about transparent AI is being able to get visibility into that entire AI lifecycle, so that when you're going to consume an AI or you're going to rely on the results of a given autonomous decision or AI model, do you have some insight into what was the training set? Where did those algorithms come from? Who created those algorithms and models? How were they trained? How were they labeled? Where was it deployed? What data sets was it initially, did that initial feedback loop inference learning happen on? So that you can make proper risk determinations around whether or not you're willing to trust this AI for the particular use. We've seen several examples out there where, university students, in a little project created an AI, threw it out in open source, and now we suddenly see that model being used for very critical decisions with no one really thinking about, well, what went into this AI? How big was the data set? Was there skewing in the data set? And so when I think of transparency, it's really about giving the consumer, whether it be a corporate, institutional, or an individual consumer of a given AI system, the ability to see what went into it. What were the building blocks? Where did it come from? Who was involved? When you flip to explainable AI, really what the question there is, you get a result. It's not today, it's very hard to say, how did the AI get from A to B to C? It saw something and it tells you this is the recommendation. How do you know? How do I verify that AI, that the outcome is correct? What is the weighting? How do I trust that weighting? And so there are some examples of why this is such a hard problem. A few years ago, an autonomous vehicle ran into a fire truck. And they needed to figure out, well, why? Why did it hit a fire? It had been trained on fire trucks. It knew what a fire truck was. Why did it make the wrong decision? And it took them a long time to peel the onion and reverse engineer why the AI actually ended up hitting the truck. And for those who are familiar with it, it hit a yellow fire truck. And they figured out, again, over a course of over a month, that it was only trained on what we all think of typically of red fire trucks. And so the data set was skewed. But there was no way to tell at that moment. That's why it made that poor decision. And the same is true on good decisions. When an AI says you should spend your money on this, you should buy this stock, or whatever the recommendation, Explainable is really being able to give you some indication of why it got to that decision. What were the decision points? And as AIs get more complex and we start fusing different models together, it's going to get harder and harder to make those, to get explainable AI. What we've seen from a technical domain is you got to build that in. You've got to build in the key points into the AI systems to start enabling explainable AI and really to enable a trusted transparency. So I'll start off with that as sort of laying the groundwork for the rest of the panel of transparent AI is really about trusting the system and the supply chain. And explainable AI is how do I trust this outcome?
So thank you, Steve. Dr. Harding, you're in a center that is trying to explain AI and develop policy. How do you place this in the UK context in your own work in the area?
Okay, so with regard to my own work, I've been kind of building machine learning tools for some time, and early on in my career, I learned to have an enormous bugbear about a term that is very commonly used, and which, when I mention it, everyone on the panel will know exactly what it is. So luckily, less and less you hear the term black box, and it's used to describe a system where you don't understand what's happening on the inside of it. And I think that there are some genuine black boxes, but very few actual literal black boxes. Most of the time, it's about sunk cost. So with Steve's example of the fire truck, it's not about, is it possible to understand? It's how much time do you need to invest to actually get to that result? And harking back to an earlier part of this conversation, we're seeing things change often enough and evolve quickly enough, not just on a singular AI basis, but within the field as a whole, that by the time you've unpicked a system and understood how it was working, then a new version of the thing is up and out and about and being applied. And then you have to apply the same time and the same effort to that. So you might need a handful of software engineers working on a problem for 6 to 9 months just to figure out what went wrong. But by the time you have, the result's pointless. So although I don't think that we have actual black boxes, I think that we can pick apart most AI systems to figure out what happened. I think functionally we do. And we wind up in this position where explainability is something we're always looking back at and we're always, kind of running away from in terms of technical development. So if we're going to be smart about this, as Steve says, we need to build stuff in from the get-go. We need to make sure the systems self-report. We need to make sure that they've got tracing mechanisms on the inside of the machinery itself that allows us to figure out what happens as it goes. Because if we're doing this forensic work, we're always going to be behind.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Dr. Harding. So we're going back to a little bit of some earlier discussion here on how we can explain this new technology, and where it will be part of explaining that is how it's adopted. So Tamara, you started us on the concept of looking at an area, and we got a very early question identifying a concern about how you separate out humor from biased conversation. So this gets us back to that question. How do you think of, when you react to the question of what is explainable about what it is you're doing, what's your thoughts on that? I think you're on mute.
Sorry. I'm always kind of thinking from the point of view of who's going to be using the information that we're outputting, right? So as Steve said, explainability is about the output. And basically, for me, what that means is how do we visualize to our readers, or to the readers of the news, right? How do we visualize how we got to our score? And so there's a couple really interesting examples on the market that like have user experiences that are examples of explainable AI. And so you can point to Grammarly, where Grammarly will like highlight the part of your sentence that caused the problem and gives you an insight as to why they said that your sentence wasn't grammatically correct. And they take it a step further and they actually suggest what you might want to add instead. And so those are two examples of AI where you can easily follow what the algorithm is picking up on in your writing that was problematic. And as a user, you have a clear behavior flow of, okay, I put in this is what it thought was problematic. And information visualization, that actual visualization layer, is a really good way to communicate those insights that the AI makes to the end user. And so I feel like that's a really important way to kind of mitigate and to build in that explainability into the AI. But as Steve said, in order to do that, you have to actually know what your AI is doing, and you have to have built in those checks into your software so that you can understand what those insights mean and then map them to things that you can visualize.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Tamara. Chloe, you have kind of an internal explainable AI mission within Intel. Not everyone at Intel necessarily is a software AI person, or you have a lot of other areas of the company. And you have an external issue, which is to, as you were developing, explain a complicated set of possible outcomes in the context of how AI is adopted. That's a tall order. Where are you cutting into that problem? How are you addressing it?
Yeah, so I think the industry is taking a lot of different approaches here. One of the things that we recently started, that we've been doing at Intel for a while, actually, is trying to take more. And I think honestly that the technology industry as a whole has been a lot more proactive about this. Is what Andrew mentioned. Thinking about what will it take to make this explainable from the beginning, not what can we do to make this explainable now that it's out there, right? And so, as Steve mentioned too, having the algorithms document themselves, documenting why decisions were made, documenting who is making those decisions, documenting each step of the process. Now, this creates a lot of data and process in of itself, but it's a much more proactive approach to figuring out, how can we put, whether it's a customer, an end user, whoever will be interacting with this technology at the forefront, right? And put them in mind when it comes to thinking about explainability, not, and honestly saving ourselves and I think the industry as a whole a lot of issue when it comes to, well, how are we going to explain this now? There are a lot of not only technical but process solutions that can be put in place to help frame sort of a path, right, for where a technology is going from the development process to deployment. And I think that really, really helps, or is one, I think, step a lot of people are taking, or a lot of companies are taking, to address this explainability solution, this issue. So it's not just a problem of, we got to figure out how to react or understand how this worked. It's more of a, let's go back at our data, look at what we've documented and figure out maybe how this went wrong or what we can do to improve it. I think that, continuous improvement of technology build is another really important part of explainability. The software and technological development process is ongoing. It's not just, hey, let's ship a product, let's get this out. Boom, we did it. I think constantly reevaluating our technology, where it's going, how it's being used is something that's really important, and that I think designers and users of technology should always take upon themselves to do. And I think it really helps also with this issue of explainability.
So thank you, Chloe. My thinking as we're evolving this discussion is, the transparency and explainability are very closely coupled around who in the audience and who are the participants in the process, and how that process is made visible to people who can then comment on it and validate different elements of it. Steve, you started us off in this session by identifying kind of points of intersection in a life cycle of development. And you use the concept that is often used in software development, which is along different points, proof of concept and so forth, in a software development life cycle. you have different possibilities of validating each step along the way. That breaks the problem down so that we may be able to test certain elements of AI without going to the output stage, which is where you actually could see a negative effect. Could you comment on that? We have a few minutes left, and perhaps we can carry this forward into a next session, but carry on.
Sure. Thank you, Jim. So when we talk about some of the challenges we've seen with the introduction of bias and skewing in our data sets and in our algorithms, when we look at things like transparency and transparent AI, being able to build those checkpoints in, but also building that visibility into the data set so that at each one of those checkpoints, you can turn around and say, okay, let's evaluate the data set. Or let's say this data set isn't big enough, it doesn't constitute enough diversity. You can make decisions early in the life cycle. And I think the best example of where we see how important this is comes from both the security world and even prior to the security world comes from the quality assurance world. Back in the 80s, there was a study done about catching bugs earlier in the development life cycle, and that if you caught a bug at design time, it would be 100x cheaper than if you caught it after it had gone to production. And if you caught it at development time, it would be something like 15x cheaper. And if you caught it at QA, it was 10 times cheaper than waiting for it to be in production. We see the same thing true with security vulnerabilities, and we see the same kind of model can be applied to AI. The earlier you identify bias, the earlier you identify either a skewing or some challenge that will be in the AI or in the AI systems or lack of labeling, the better the outcome will be and the cheaper it will be to go back and fix it versus having to wait until you've got bad outcomes and then undo that whole system. And so I think we need to apply tried and true techniques for securing and getting that AI transparency that will, again, enable some of that explainability we were talking about. But if you can't trust the AI, the explainable is sort of a secondary issue. You've got to be able to trust the AI systems are going to give you good outcomes. And that's why building in transparency from the get-go and identifying, and I'm not saying that every data set is bad, and even having a skewed data set is important if you can couple it with others. You're going to try to, because data is king, you want to try to get as much data as you can. And so being able to identify that at each stage of the process is really how we're going to successfully deploy better AIs going forward.
Okay, thank you, Steve. That reconnects us to where you started this discussion, which was to look at elements that we could intersect in the development process. I'd like to transition. First of all, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for this first session, and I'd like to thank everyone who has submitted questions and has involved themselves in kind of this discussion today. And I'll bridge to our next session, which is that if we didn't get to your question, one of the things we'll be doing is reviewing any of the questions that we did not get to, and we'll address them in the next session. I want to take this opportunity to thank all of our panelists. I think we've covered a lot of ground here. I'm hoping that we all agree that we've raised as many questions as we've answered. Since we're at the beginning of this process, the reason we're all involved in it is because we feel that there are a lot of questions to be answered. I think this is an activity which requires everyone's views from very different sectors of society and from academic and business organizations and cultural organizations. I think everyone, and Dr. Harding, you reflected that in some of your points. I think it's a very important set of ideas, and I do believe, going back to some of the very first things that we said, we've been at this for a long time, and I'm hoping that we can use both what we already know and test out the new things, and do that in a way that we can all collaborate on this activity, because I think this is a highly collaborative activity to get it right. So let me now close my role in this first session. I'll transition to our host, but I'm looking forward to our next session, where we will pick off some of these questions and allow this panel to again address some of the questions. Steve, I'll throw it back to you for the transition to the next segment in the show.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, everyone. I want to welcome you to our show corner titled Turing Test Failed, They Suspect Nothing. I'm honored to have Camille Nebeker here with us today, who is the research ethicist and associate professor of behavioral medicine at in the Department of Family Medicine and Public Health in the School of Medicine at UC San Diego. Camille has her research focus areas in two really intersecting areas: community research capability building, capacity building, example, citizen science and community engaged research, and digital health research ethics around consent, access, privacy expectations, and data management. She directs the UC San Diego Research Center for Optimal Digital Ethics, or RECODE Health, and is affiliated with the UCSD Design Lab. Her research has received continuous support from government, foundation, and industry sources since 2002. So welcome, Camille, to the show.
Oh, thank you so much, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here.
So our topic today in the show corner is how can the use of AI in the health sector, when deployed with the best of intentions, go bad? Or really, we'll be looking at the implications of forms of individual and group level surveillance like digital phenotyping or flagging suicide ideation, contact tracing, or wastewater testing for identifying COVID-19 exposure, and how this application of AI can both be a source of great concern while at the same time being a possible force for good. So, Camille, how can digital contact tracing and some of these other methods that are being evaluated and deployed using whether it be wearables or phone apps lead to terrible or bad outcomes?
You know, I think that this sector of artificial intelligence in the first panel really covered a lot of really great points. What I've found is that health has been slow to the table. And so while there is a lot going on in transportation and in finance, the health industry is very, very conservative and really wants to make sure that what they do is thoughtful and data-driven. And so it's been really interesting to see one of the areas that I think is ripe for applications of AI is our electronic health record. And what I think is really interesting about that is the electronic health record was not built to do diagnostic. It is built as a billing tool. So the whole function and purpose of your electronic health record is not to support health decisions and diagnostics. And so starting with that, you first of all have a system that wasn't built for what it's being turned to. So those kind of things are really important. And as you were mentioning in the earlier panel, it's really critical that we think about, is the data in that data set representative? Could it unintentionally increase health disparities because of how it's being used? And these are really critical questions. In one area, they want to, and I'm on several committees with our health system, to use AI to figure out when they should double book. And this is for hospital management. So how do you make sure that people show up? And if they don't show up, somebody's in that position to be treated. Well, you can do that. One bad outcome is that you may have people that have trouble with transportation. They may have childcare issues. Something's keeping them from making their appointment. And if the AI is making decisions based on prior no-show, then it's going to perpetuate a problem. So my question to the health system is, why are these patients not making their appointment? Can we look at the problem, the source of the cause, and not just at this technology and how it can actually, help with billing and making sure patients are in the rooms? So there's one area. The other part that could be problematic is medication adherence. And so you can look at claims data. You can triangulate that with self-reported data that is in the electronic health record and clinician notes. So you can actually use AI to confirm without a doubt that certain populations are less likely to adhere to medication. That then could either be used to say, well, let's find out what's the problem. Again, going to the social determinants of health, the things that do influence how people make decisions and behave with respect to health. But if you don't look at the root cause, you've just basically created a weapon. And that weapon will then make it impossible for people of certain ethnic backgrounds to get insurance.
So you bring up an interesting point that sometimes we're asking the wrong questions of these AI systems. Instead of asking, in the case of the double booking, they're looking for efficiencies in the system as opposed to asking the real question, which is what's causing the no-shows in the first place. And so I think that's a fundamental problem that we've seen, and we discussed, only briefly in the past panel around making sure that you point the AI at the right data and making to get the right kind of outcomes. In a couple of the examples you were already talking about and others, have you seen some modern hypothetical examples of how AI in healthcare usage could become ethically challenging, whether it be in the case that you talked about with the medical adherence or other cases where the path, the road to hell was laid with good intentions?
Yeah, I work with, I'm working on a project that is called Artificial Intelligence to Support Healthy Aging. And so we have what they call the silver tsunami. We have an incredibly fast-growing older adult population, and AI could be used in ways that will really facilitate older adults living independently longer. So it could be a game changer for people, and that's important. I think we need to do everything we can to use AI in ways that create these efficiencies responsibly. And so when I think about many of the people I work with are psychiatrists, and, that is an area where a lot of face-to-face communications is really important. The nuances of facial expression, voice tone, there are things that are really unique about human-to-human conversation that cannot be replicated at this point in time with artificial intelligence. And at the same time, you can see how, we're calling this the double pandemic, where you combine COVID-19 with social isolation, which for older adults is a huge problem. And now we've got a double whammy in that quarantine is making it so older adults have to stay isolated for their own health and safety. And yet at the same time, they're evaluating, is it worth it for me to be isolated because it's killing me? So if we can then use artificial intelligence to help augment decision-making by clinicians, I think then it's a tool that is really useful. But replacing that, it's not going to be a helpful area. Whereas in radiology, you can train AI on tens of thousands of x-rays. And at that point in time, it is so much more efficient than a manual process of evaluating a specific type of cancer. So, we're making progress in that respect, but there's still a ways to go. And I can see it really working well with radiology and not so much with psychiatry.
So when we talk about how do we deploy these AI systems in healthcare in a way that is beneficial, there's some aspect of governance that has to come into play. So how should we start thinking about the ecosystem of AI and how to govern it to make sure that it does get used for the proper medical outcome use case as opposed to maybe being used as a weapon in some other cases?
Yeah, I have to just step back a little bit because I work in behavioral sciences. A lot of the work that we do is to try to prevent disease. Get at people early so that we can promote healthy behaviors. And where that has introduced digital tools is in the form of wearable sensors. And so about 8 years ago, I got involved with helping behavioral scientists think about how do they do their work ethically. And these sensor technologies, they're undergirded by AI, but they're wearable sensors. You can put them on your wrist like an Apple Watch or a Fitbit or an Aura ring that you put on your finger, and it takes, you can get information about your sleep patterns, your respiration, heart rate, all of these different kinds of metrics that help people think about their health. And, we've started thinking about how do we help researchers think about what is it when we ask them to make ethical decisions? And a lot of times, even that word ethics just takes people down a weird road. They think it's supposed to be philosophers or some kind of legal scholar. And we're really trying to increase and elevate the responsibility of the individual clinician. But more so for me, I focus on behavioral scientists and researchers. How do we get them to engage and adopt the fact that they need to be thinking about access and usability, data management, privacy, risks and benefits, and not outsource those decisions to an external body? So we've really been trying to elevate awareness and educate researchers in this area. And then that extends in our environment in the academic setting. There are external boards that are called institutional review boards that are supposed to be reviewing research that involves human beings. And as AI is getting more entwined with these different kinds of wearable sensors or remote sensors, ingested sensors, the ability for institutional review boards to do a good job is becoming less likely. And so as a community, as all of us are here together, we all have a really important role in doing ethical research, training the people in our companies. But in terms of governance, we've created a digital health checklist, and we did that through first step was an expert panel where we got bioethicists and researchers and regulators and legal scholars, a lot of people who are in the ecosystem, to tell us where the gaps were. And then we tested it, and now we're doing further validation of this checklist. And that's the form of governance. It's getting the people involved who are most impacted. Our next step is to get the people who are using these products more involved. One of the downsides of use of digital health tools is that they're not accessible to most people. They're at a price point where it is a certain SES, socioeconomic status, that will have access. They're usually tested with younger people, 18 to 35 years old. I live in San Diego County, where we have a minority-majority state. So Latin American population here is 40%. We have a very large and growing Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander community. As I mentioned, older adults are going to move from representing about 12% of the population to 25% in the next 10, 15 years. We really have to get on the ground with the people that have the most to lose and the most to gain from these technologies, and have them involved in helping to shape the, access, usability, privacy, data management, and risk-benefit assessments.
So can you give me an example of where involving those that are actually the impacted community, the ones that are actually going to end up using that wearable, or being the ones that the data is going to be collected from, has been beneficial as far as the design of those systems?
It's hugely beneficial. And yes, I'd love to give you an example. So I've been working, as I mentioned, with this older adult community, and they are in a retirement community that is classified as independent living, assisted living, and then managed care. So they're all eligible to be in the independent living. So early on, we were talking about putting sensors in the walls, sensors on the toilet, sensors on their remote, sensors on the soup cans, just so we could know about every single behavior they were doing in their own private home, so that we could then ideally look at micro behaviors and potentially predict whether or not that person might have a stroke 3 weeks down the road. So these little micro behaviors that wouldn't be detectable to the eye can be detected by having a lot of signal through these sensors. Well, nobody on the research team had spoken to the residents about what they could tolerate. And so I started doing that work a couple of years ago to find out what would they think about having a sensor under the bed or on the toilet or in the toilet, so that everything that they were doing was being monitored. And they had a lot of concerns. They were super curious. I mean, they really want their age to be of value to science. They have a lot of lived experiences. They have less to lose. I mean, they don't have to worry about being discriminated against when it comes to the job market. They've already retired. But they were thinking about what could possibly go wrong here. And they talked about their concerns about their finances. What if somebody understands that they are going to have a stroke? Is anyone going to tell them? So what's our obligation as a researcher to share information back with them? And that opened up a whole new area of research for me, which is called return of information, because traditionally we don't give people back information who are in research studies. And now we're starting to figure out how do we work as partners with our research participants so that it's much more of a give and take. And yesterday, I did work with 8 older adults in a focus group to share back information that we were learning from them about how quarantine is affecting their mental and physical health. And technology is such a key to their survival right now. And many of them don't have access. I mean, we were lucky to have a subset of about 30 people who could use Zoom. And yet here we are. This is our everyday life right now, right?
Do you find that when dealing with the older community, this is an interesting area, that they have a different viewpoint on the privacy concerns around the sensorization of their entire environment that you would maybe not get or get a different response from a younger participant in this research study?
Yeah, we actually did a survey of our older adults, and we had already collected data from adolescents and young adults, so people that were 13 to 25. And we were creating a privacy scale around health privacy, and the older adults and the younger adults are significantly different. I don't think we needed a survey to tell that, but those that have grown up who are digital natives versus non, there is a difference. Older adults are less likely to trade their information for some kind of a perk, whereas younger adults will trade their privacy for $5 off of, some kind of jacket. I mean, it's incredible what they're willing to trade. And so I think privacy-wise, the older adults use this word hoodwinked. They're worried because they don't know what they don't know. And so they get worried that somebody's going to take advantage of them. And I did a quick survey last summer on the apps that were marketed to older adults. And then I looked at their privacy policies to see whether or not it would potentially exploit them. And they're dangerous. So I think we really need to come up with some guidelines and standards for protecting, especially the most vulnerable populations that stand to be, they're really at risk when it comes to the use of AI. So I'm hoping that we can come up with some guidelines and standards that the industry as a whole will adhere to.
So I wanted to key on something that was we talked about earlier. There's some studies that have been done using AI on wastewater and being able to detect COVID in a wastewater environment. How involved should a community or an apartment building be in understanding that the city or the county or the state are monitoring the wastewater from a given location? And how, does there need to be a shared model of informed consent or at least governance on how that data is used? And like you just said, if you detect that there is a COVID in a particular environment, how should they be notified? Where does privacy and control come into play? How have you seen that play out in the real world, since we are living in it right now?
Yeah, we are living in it. I'm doing a design fiction in a couple weeks that is all about how we're managing our lives right now around surveillance. And a year ago, it would have been a design fiction, and now it's our reality. And at the UC San Diego campus, we are testing wastewater to detect COVID. And we are just now putting these programs in place. And my role and what I'm working on now is how do we convene the students and employees to design a protocol for surveillance, for wastewater surveillance, for proximity tracing, and isolation. So in the COVID wastewater, in this area where these bathrooms were, they found COVID traces. So they were able to tell people who were using that restroom between Wednesday and Friday that testing was available and they needed to get tested. So now they identified 2 people out of the 500 tests that they did. So they now have identified who was ill. Now they can do action. They can take action, all the while protecting that individual's privacy. But at this point, we have not convened the community to find out, is this right? Are we doing this right? And in order for any of this surveillance to be adopted and utilized in a way that it's going to help us address this virus, we need to be on the same team. And to do that, we have to talk to everyone to get people on board. And that's going to be some steps that we start taking here really soon. It's important. Privacy and agency is critical.
So yeah, I think what you're talking about here is community governance, or a shared governance model, as we sometimes talk about in the technology world. That's also at the same time, especially with the broad set of constituents or entities involved from both the institutional state. You take particular landlords and then individuals within a given environment. It does seem to be like a complex issue of trying to do informed consent, informed governance. How have you seen successes, or or do you think that there's a possibility where we could get to that community shared governance model?
I think one of the things I've observed is this tension between regulatory compliance and when do you have to get consent, and how do you do it when you have to, versus how should you do it because it's the right thing to do. And an example that, in research language, if at the San Diego Zoo, they wanted to see whether signage increased people's likelihood to buy sunscreen, that's a population level study. It's pretty benign. They don't really need to get consent, but they could let people know, hey, we're doing this study, or after they leave, basically. So once they exit the zoo, they could say, hey, you were part of a really interesting study. We're trying to see whether or not this influences that. That way they don't bias the study, but they keep the public informed of what's going on. And you don't feel like, you're part of a natural experiment. The thing about these population studies is they're more likely to be successful if the community is on board and informed. So in research ethics, we follow the principles of the Belmont Report, which are respect for persons, that's demonstrated through informed consent; beneficence, which is the risk-benefit assessment. With the likelihood of there being a risk, there's also potentially a benefit. If there's no benefit, no matter what the risk is, you shouldn't do it. And then justice is the principle of undue burden. People should not be exploited. Those who are likely to benefit should be included. And then we added one called respect for law and public interest, which was initiated through the Menlo Report, which was part of the Department of Homeland Security's work in wanting to see how information and communication technology should be managed because of AI and where we were going. So in 2012, they published the Menlo Report, and we've adopted some of that as our ethical framework. But principles, there's hundreds of principles. These are the 4 I like to use because I think they're tried and true, but it's the practices that we have to really think about. Like, yeah, you can have all the principles you want, but unless you know how to enact those and put them into play, then it's not going to go well. So with these population studies, communication is key. So we'll be convening employees and students to ask them, how should we be communicating? What is the best strategy when somebody or an area is identified as potentially a hotspot? Is it likely that you will relax your protections because you think these sensor systems are going to protect you? Will they likely change behaviors either favorably or not? We have to ask some of these questions, and then we need to observe actual behaviors over time.
That is a great point. I've seen examples, in experimentation where by informing, you actually do skew the outcome because people respond differently once they know they're being watched. People either act better, or in some cases, they may take stronger risks because, someone's watching my back. And that then can skew the whole thing. That sort of feeds into this concept of how best to implement those principles. And I like the way you described it, is that there's the principles, which are the foundation, but it's how do you enact those in practice? How do you then translate them from a nice diagram or paper into real world practice? And I think in the last couple of minutes we have, what advice would you give to both those that are helping to build these technologies or design these research programs of the future that are leveraging AI? What would be some advice you would give them about translating the paper principles into practical ways of implementing them and getting them into practice?
I love your question. And I immediately thought, and I'm grateful to have this opportunity to work with computer science and engineering students. And for the past 5-6 years, I've worked with amazing students Two of them I took along with me to focus groups that we were doing in the retirement community 2 years ago. And they said they wanted to learn to prototype. And I said, well, come with me to this focus group, take notes, help me out with it. And honestly, one of them was nearly in tears afterwards. He says, they never have us engage with people in our program. We never talk to people. I haven't been around an older adult other than my grandfather ever. So they don't know who these people are that they're trying to design things for, and especially in health. If you don't understand health and healthcare and health behaviors, then you need to partner with the people that do. So this is going to be a very interdisciplinary ecosystem. And we really need to bring together the right people in these conversations and expose the technology builders to people that they're designing for. So design thinking is a really core part, human-centered design. So yeah, I think our engineering students really need opportunities to be around and actually be required to be with people that they're designing for.
Well, thank you so much, Camille. This was a fascinating discussion, and I know our audience loved hearing about it. I just want to give you a chance to give us any last parting thoughts before we switch over to panel number 2. But once again, I want to thank you so much for really enlightening us about the ethical challenges that are faced in the healthcare environment. So we'll give you a chance to sort of leave us with your parting thought on that.
Well, like I said, healthcare is slower to the game. It is a very conservative. Obviously, we're dealing with human health, and that's critical. That's not to say that other industries are not as important, because what I'm seeing is other industries are becoming health related. So where I used to think of, Fitbit was a health tech company, now they're doing research. So I'm observing what was the traditional researchers working in academic environments that have rules and regulations, ethical acculturation. So they also have a lot of training. And now what I'm seeing is that these different sectors are starting to get involved with health, either, through these different kinds of wearables or through, big data analyses. And they don't have that same training, acculturation, or regulation. And so our ecosystem is variable when it comes to training and expectations about ethical decision-making. And I think we really need to kind of come together, because I don't like regulations to drive how I behave. I would much rather a community of peers be those whom I'm accountable to, rather than a regulatory compliance agency. So I would really encourage us to work carefully together and move this needle forward. But thank you so much for having me on the panel today.
Camille, thank you so much. And again, thank you for your time and your insights. So with that, we're going to conclude our show corner and transition to our second panel. Once again, I want to thank everyone for joining. We're going to start our second panel, and I want to start by introducing the panelists. Once again, I'm Steve Orrin, the Federal CTO for Intel Corporation, and I'll be moderating the panel today. With us today, we'll have Chloe Autio, who is the AI Policy Lead for Intel Corp, Dr. Andrew Harding, who's a Senior Technology and Policy Advisor at the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation for the UK government, Dr. Jim Short, who is the Research Director and Lead Scientist and Co-Founder for the Center of Large-Scale Data Systems at San Diego Supercomputer Center, and Tamara Zubatiy, the CEO of VeriCrypt. So with that, I'd like to kick us off by stating some foundational things. And I guess any conversation around AI and ethics and how we put this together and start thinking about the future, I like to start with something from the past and something a little fun. So I'm going to read to you today Asimov's 3 rules and 3 laws for robots. A robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. A robot must obey the orders given it by human beings, except where such orders conflict with the first law. And a robot must protect its own existence as long and as such protection does not conflict with the first and second laws. So starting off with that, let's take a look at how do we ensure an ethical approach to the development and controls around artificial intelligence? How should we go about securing these systems and methods of embedding ethics throughout the life cycle, and pick up on some of the themes that we talked about in the first panel? And then I also want to hit on how we delve into the social and institutional approaches to ethical AI. So once again, I want to welcome all our panelists to the show. And let's kick things off with a discussion about how do we start to address bias in AI? And so with that, I'm going to start off with Dr. Short from the Supercomputer Center in San Diego. Tell us a little bit about how you would think about addressing bias in AI systems.
Hi, Steve. Thank you, and hello to everyone again in the second session. So the question of bias is one that we address not just in AI, of course. We address it in a lot of different ways that we design systems. And we have different approaches in the development lifecycle, as we discussed in the first session, about how bias introduces itself at different elements in that lifecycle. So I tend to think of it as both an input problem. How do you develop a representative set? I thought Camille's points were well taken, which is that in the input side of it, which is in the design of systems, you have to have people that are related, that are intended and designed to look at it for the populations that they are designing those systems for. So one bias reduction strategy would be to populate your early stages of development with that kind of expertise and that kind of interaction. She spoke to a very important element in having students who were involved in designing some of the proof of concept, involved in going out and looking at the age-at-home environments that we're actually designing systems. I think that's one piece. The second piece, quickly, is that you have to look at it as an output measure. Chloe from Intel mentioned that topic in the first session, which is that you have to be very concerned with the elements of the social impact, which we think of as an exogenous variable. What are you doing internally, and then what happens when those systems are deployed? So my thought is how do you uncover bias? Well, you uncover bias by having an output variable which is as broadly diffused as possible, because the sources of bias in the output measure is determined by its application and the scope of that application. So you have to validate the process both internally in the development cycle and externally in its application.
So, Chloe, let's talk a little about how you would see it from a potential policy perspective. Part of your role is to help write the policy for a large corporation of how it deals with AI. What are some of your thoughts around how you institutionalize ethical behaviors or removing bias in how AI is developed at a large-scale tech company?
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, and I think a lot of it will go back to what we discussed in the prior panel. A lot of it, when we talk about policy, it sounds like writing things down or making processes, but really what that involves is getting people to come together to form a community around doing the right thing. And so at a company, as you know, that can be really, really hard, particularly when at Intel, or not about doing the right thing, but, to form a community where these discussions can happen, particularly when you work at a company that employs over 100,000 people. How on earth are we going to institutionalize or operationalize, and kind of like what Camille said, the principles that we have, how can we do that in practice? And I think what really helps is having, really wide cast stakeholder buy-in. So communicating to the people that matter, leadership, executive leadership, external stakeholders, policymakers, the importance of having systems and processes like these in place to ensure that what we're building has checks, responsibility checks, impact assessments, documentation, anything having to do with accountability in place. And so at a company as big as Intel, one of the things we do is, like I said earlier in the previous panel, is create a stakeholder group of senior designers, engineers, researchers, social scientists, policy professionals like myself, and people from, business, corporate responsibility, get them together in a room and talk about, not only how do we develop these processes, but let's continue this dialogue and address projects and situations where they arise together, not just in silos as business, operations, supply chain over here, policy, legal. Everyone is working together to make sure that these issues are addressed and that we have both technical and process and policy solutions in place to help address bias. So that's a little bit of a taste of what we're doing at a company like Intel.
Yeah, thank you, Chloe. And being on, also working at Intel, I'm on the receiving end of having to design to all those different checkpoints and statuses. I want to go to even a more macro level. Andrew, when you look at a government like the UK, how would you think about whether it be regulating or institutionalizing the identification and addressing of bias in AI systems and data sets?
So I'm gonna grab Chloe's last theme and just run with it, which is absolutely you need a whole bunch of different folks to figure out what appropriate action looks like, and you need folks way beyond the technical sphere in just full decision-making capacity to really understand how to implement this stuff. But there's a lot of uncertainty here with different companies and different actors. Not everybody has the capacity to be in the room where that discussion is happening, or even to have the expertise to utilize that information. So really clear guidance is needed to enable people to follow best practice when it comes to kind of bias. And that can come from regulation, it can come from policy, it can come from, as was mentioned previously, by kind of peer groups, but some kind of centralized norm, some kind of guide for what can be followed to have good action is necessary. Mostly, we see a situation at the moment where companies don't know how to approach institutional problems they might have previously. They don't necessarily know how to, provide legal compliance. They don't necessarily know how to address biases that they might have identified themselves and need to move forward on into the future. So if we can provide like solid reports, solid guidance, solid regulation that allows people to know that if they follow sensible steps, they'll be on the right side of not just legislation, but history, I guess, then it'll really help institutionalize these decisions in a really positive way. And it's got to be aimed at a broad spectrum of actors as well. It needs to be at the institutional level so that policymakers and decision makers in organizations and businesses can take those standards and norms and spin them into their organization. And it needs to have understandable repercussions for technical development so those teams know how to act.
Thank you. So Tamara, as the other end of the spectrum of one who actually has to implement an AI system and identify bias in your own data sets and training, how have you looked at identifying potential bias in your training sets and implemented practices and procedures, to key in on one of the last things Camille was talking about, going from principles into practice in your own organization to address the bias problem?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. That's a great question. I feel like it's kind of an ongoing labor of love that's very intensive. And so it kind of starts with, for each of our models, being sure that we take the time before, like when we make a new change, to go back and look at our data sets and visualize all the data sets and look at, well, are we missing something? If maybe the data that we're getting, is it skewed? Is it not representative? And again, it's hard for us to see the whole picture if we're just looking at one data set, but that is definitely one of the steps that we need to take, is actually like looking at the data and exploring the data, and then looking into measuring our accuracy, various types of quality assurance, gut checking, scoring all sorts of different content to make sure that there's not hidden interactions or things that we can't account for. A lot of research, a lot of just like running a lot of content through and then measuring the outputs and then looking at what we expected and then what actually happened. And so it really is at all of the phases. And then also kind of at the end, when it comes to deploying the content and like deploying the models and giving them to people, it's like when we're working with a new customer, we talk to them and we have to understand if they're if the way in which they want to use it is consistent with the way in which we want it to be used. Because at the end of the day, it's still on us, the way in which they use it. And so if we're doing our job right, then they can trust the outputs of our scores. But it's a really fine line that we walk, where if we let any bias into our models that we didn't intend to be there, then people can be really misled. So I feel like it's just kind of an ongoing process of validation and making sure that it's behaving as we expect.
Indeed, indeed. Andrew, I want to throw something back at you a little bit and just use you to start this conversation. When we talk about ethics and doing ethical AI and addressing bias that may be inherent in AI systems or in the data sets, how do you deal with the fact that different communities, or in your case, different governments, may have different values or different definitions of what is considered to be ethical behavior?
This is a really thorny question. This sense of kind of what is fair and what is unfair is so variable. You might find that someone in a community feels that one thing is fair, while one of their peers feels that it's absolutely not. And it can vary along very strange lines. It can vary most certainly with age. It can vary with kind of economic background, as mentioned by Camille. It can vary by voting intention. It can vary in all kinds of different and odd ways. So when you look at things like academic literature on algorithmic fairness, and you see this noble attempt to try and encode fairness and bias metrics into machine learning in such a way that you'll be able to detect, measure, and mitigate against bias, you can't help but feel that this is a very, very difficult subject, and it's hard to manage. I think, firstly, you have to have really big open dialogue with your public, whoever that is, whoever the end recipient of your tool is, and you have to allow that ongoing conversation to help people feel like they're being listened to and inculcate that kind of trust that you mentioned earlier. So first thing is you have to have that transparency, that trust. Otherwise, you're not going to get anywhere at all. Second thing is you really have to look into agency and how people feel like they have control over their own destiny or not, because that, it turns out, is a massive factor in whether people think things are fair or not. And kind of lastly, you have to have enough oversight and enough kind of, again, human control of how these things are implemented to be able to make sure that you've not missed nuance or context, which are infamously absent in many machine learning tools.
So, Jim, maybe you can talk to us a little bit, with your background in data science, about agency and how you bring agency to bear when you're starting to think about decision systems and AI systems. I think you're still on mute, Jim.
Thanks, Steve. Sorry about that. We got this discussion started in the context of thinking about who participates in the process, both in an input and an output side. That's kind of where I start. And Camille, in your interview and that session, mentioned the Belmont report. And I think for those who are joining this session, if you don't know what the Belmont report is, have a look at it if you want to look at this context of what we're trying to address in the notion of ethics, because it's basically a summary of what I would call institutional norms and policy development for how institutions try to promulgate policies to control behavior. I mean, that's more or less what the Belmont report does. What is striking about AI, and I think Andrew and others have mentioned it in the first and the subsequent discussions, is who has agency in the discussion of what is ethical AI. And I would submit that we've discussed three different elements of that. We've discussed institutional control, which is the traditional health system. That's one. Corporations, of course, manage a good deal of the institutional control over a lot of data that we have. The second would be communities, and Camille mentioned the notion of communities And that's important because in principle, communities have a higher degree of what Andrew mentioned, which is a shared trust. So you have a notion that people are aligned in a community. So a healthcare community with people with, for example, pre-existing conditions would be an example of the notion that you might have a more favorable notion if it was done correctly, if you worked very closely with that community. And of course, the third is individual, which is the ability of the individual affected by AI to have agency in the process. So one is whether you have voice in the decision making by institutions. Another is whether you have a technology that actually allows you to have voice by the control of the use of that technology. That's a whole different topic area. And I think that we're investigating, and maybe we can develop that, but a quick example of that is in the blockchain area. Part of the whole idea of blockchain is that individuals have some degree of access and permission structures to access information over the life cycle of that data. So there's various elements in this which I think come together with this notion of where bias exists, what technologies are in development to secure privacy and other related activities associated with that data over the lifetime of the data.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. And I mean, there's a lot to unpack there that I think we can hit on here. Chloe, I want to start with you. And so as we look at taking a dive deeper into how do we, from a corporate level or from a group level, start to institutionalize the necessary transparency so that you can give agency to the constituents and agency to the developers who are working with it. What would be some of your thoughts, just to sort of pick up on the themes we ended the last panel on, around implementing those practices throughout the AI lifecycle and supply chain around transparency?
So I think it really involves a lot of the things that Andrew said about trust and community building, and those I think the effects of those two issues are they maintain whether you're working as part of a policy team, as part of an engineering team, within a government, as part of a community who is trying to adopt a new technology, as exampled by Camille's discussion. But one of the things I think that, organizations can do is communicate very clearly from the top why decisions are made. Different organizations obviously have different policies when it comes to sharing information. There are a lot of legal risks involved. There are a lot of different, communities and stakeholders involved that sometimes, don't necessitate the sharing and facilitation sharing of certain information. But I think when it comes to understanding why and how decisions are made, organizations must take it upon themselves to share a lot of that, whether it's with employees or with users, with customers. One thing that we do at Intel in terms of responsible AI is, as I said earlier, it's very similar, I think, from an Intel process point of view as the explainability stuff. But, sharing, documenting, being very intentional about the way decisions are made and who is making those decisions, and ensuring to communicate that, I think, is a really important element of transparency, at least from an organizational point of view. I can't speak to how that works in the government or within civil society or other organizations, but I think at Intel, and particularly an extremely nebulous organization like Intel, where there's hundreds of thousands of people working there, having a really clear sense of responsibility for AI, responsible AI, principles, and a way to communicate how those principles are being adopted and operationalized is a critical part of transparency, because from the top to the bottom, people then can understand what their role is in that responsibility and what they can do to enact that role.
Yeah, thank you. In our prior panel, we talked about these sort of two different concepts of transparent AI and transparency in that life cycle and supply chain, and explainable AI, and being able to ascertain how the AI came up with the answers it did. Tamara, in your business, which is relying on AI to give answers to your customers and to the people that rely on you, how have you dealt with the challenge of getting to explainable AI or being able to convince them that that when you identified bias, that it was correct, and that was in fact a biased out set of news feeds from your experience?
Yeah, I feel like reports and case studies have been the most effective way that we can kind of communicate to our users at this point, since we don't have that user experience with the visually explainable AI kind of built out yet. So the most convincing thing that we can do for people is giving them scoring content that they're familiar with before, that maybe they have thoughts about, and then once they see the score, they can kind of interpret it into their thoughts. So to provide an example, we worked with a local San Diego investigative news reporting organization, and we kind of took in their entire RSS feed blind. And then in our outputs, we were able to see majority of their content was over on the side of being very objective, much more objective actually than most of the content that we had ever scored, which was really cool. But then we saw this spike, and it was all of the editorials that they had ever written. And it was every single editorial was in that little spike. And so for them, that was really convincing, because at first they were kind of shocked. They were like, what? We have all of this content that is so biased. And then when they dug into it, they were able to follow why all of those pieces of content were marked biased. They clearly had that editorial kind of leaning. And so I feel like at the moment that providing people with those reports and those case studies is a really effective way of showing it to them. But at the same time, that method in itself creates biases, because people are already biased about the content that they're presenting or the content that they are getting the feedback about. But it is a really effective way to kind of explain to people what the algorithm is seeing and why it's making those decisions. I think you're muted, Steve. I'm
muted again. Okay, sorry about that. Jim, maybe we can take the conversation back to something you're talking about when you talk about agency and look at the communities themselves. We have seen examples, we talked about them in the last panel, of where AI has gone horribly wrong or have done, started surveilling people that weren't really interested in that and wanted to opt out. Can you talk a little bit about some of the individual resistance to bad or potentially gray uses of AI? What are some examples you have? And then I want to open it up to the overall panel, because I think it's important for people to know that we're not all beholden to what the institutions or the governments decide to do, that we all have agency here as well. So Jim, I'd like you to kick us off, and then I'm going to sort of do a round robin on how we individually can influence or resist bad uses of AI.
Well, let me, so I'm at a supercomputer center that does a lot of sponsored research in areas of technology. And we do a lot of work in the area of scientific data collection. And a lot of it nowadays is in healthcare. So let me just roll up quickly in view of time, an example. So one of the concerns about the lack of private control of where your healthcare data goes, we're seeing now well illustrated in the difficulties of getting people to participate in COVID trials. And the issue there is because people are not sure what's going to happen to their data once it's entered into the COVID system. So from a science point of view, there is a tremendous cost to not being transparent and a presumption of bias, which is an institutional bias, with populations that are resistant to the idea that they trust the institution to properly handle that data over the scientific investigation process. This becomes a fairly dramatic problem, because in principle, we have 40 or 50 years of regulations on HIPAA, et cetera, et cetera. It's one of the most regulated areas. So in principle, we're starting from the proposition that this is supposed to be one of the most trusted areas. Well, we're finding that, in fact, in many populations that need to be represented in the COVID vaccine trial data, and we're one of those areas at UC San Diego, and we're reading reports that in the UC San Diego system, they're having difficulty signing up populations that are necessary to validate the effectiveness of a vaccine treatment. So this is, I think, a dramatic example illustrated by the difficulties today of where lack of transparency lack of explainability can directly affect the progress and the advancement of an effective vaccine treatment.
So, Tamara, what are some examples that you've seen of individuals resisting the bad AI, whether they be things like going off the grid or opting out, or in some more malicious cases, data poisoning? Can you talk a little bit about some of those kinds of attacks or methodologies that individuals can employ to help, at least for their perspective, get agency back when it's been taken from them?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like there's all sorts of different things that people do. We're kind of in a privacy paradox where some people might claim that they have certain requirements or beliefs about what they need for their privacy, but then their behavior doesn't really match them. But we do find people that are staying true to their values and their behavior, and they, for example, might use a different web browser, not Google, but maybe DuckDuckGo or some other alternative. Or they might use blockers that block their metadata when they're interacting with the internet, so that different companies or advertisers can't get their get access to that metadata. But if you consider the AI ecosystem that we're all embedded in, it's really hard to avoid using these tools of convenience, and it's hard to not trade our privacy for convenience. But another good example that I can think of was an alternative to Tile for geolocation. It was a San Diego company called XYO. And they were basically making a blockchain version of the Tile system. So you didn't have to have all of your data centralized with Tile. It was really a decentralized application. And based on other people's tiles, that's how the network was formed. Or not tiles, sorry. They had their own beacons. They were these cute little, very similar to Tile type of things. But it really, the main point is that you basically have to actively resist. If you just continue passively living your life, you're just falling, you are a material, you are raw data that people are exploiting. Unless you actively choose to not be exploitable and defend yourself in various ways, then kind of your data is up for grabs and people are making money off of it.
Thank you. So, Andrew, what are some of your thoughts on individual resistance to bad or great uses of AI?
So I think there's lots of opportunity for people to have pretty passive, pretty light resistance to a lot of these processes. And folks are going to, as long as the benefit that they gain from being part of that system is not clear or is not proportionate to what is being asked of them. So in the most simple case, if you're asked for your details while signing into somebody's Wi-Fi, you may lie. You may give them a burner email address and completely false details. You might mickey.mouse@disney.com and just let that run, because the benefit you gain from giving them information is minimal compared to the service you're being provided, and the two aren't tethered at all. You can see a lot of kind of resistance by individual small fashion companies to facial recognition technology. So you can see patterns developed weirdly in naval warfare now being used to develop masks or bandanas or the like, which produce a kind of a dazzle pattern that screws with how people recognize faces in kind of dark and light areas, because there's no real benefit for them to interact with a facial recognition technology of any kind. So why not opt out via the medium of that mechanism? My favorite story of this is you'll be aware of kind of loyalty cards that you get for supermarket shopping. And in the UK, I've heard anecdotal tales of student halls all having one card for one supermarket, and they just tack it to the fridge, and every time someone goes out to the shop, they take their card and they take it with them. And because you're talking about 6, 12, maybe 20 individuals all using the same card, the data is essentially meaningless. And they get all the deals from all of the purchases that they would buy. So again, the kind of what you're giving and what you're getting aren't tethered and provide you no reason not to spoof, your information. There's a really interesting kind of side subject on this, which is that on the internet, you are usually only displaying one part of yourself at any given time, and it's taken as being absolute or total. So you might be in a particular age bracket, you might be of a particular gender, you might be from a particular ethnic background. And whatever you give a particular system is taking as being representative of your totality. Whereas in real life, you may at times act quite younger than your age or older than your age. You may have traits that would normally come from your educational background or the fact you were born overseas or however it works. But that whole process is totally opaque when it comes to information systems that track or follow. So only when people are given the ability to gain the equivalent amounts of value from what they provide and represent themselves fully will people not be tempted to evade or spoof or arrange other mechanisms to get around systems and processes. And if you're in governance, whether that's national or corporate, it behooves you to be transparent, direct, and just nice about what you want to give.
Thank you for that. Chloe, you mentioned earlier that when you were talking about how Intel has looking at ethical AI, that they set up a body to help guide the overall organization. So if you're thinking about some of the input you would have into that body as far as how to define what are ethical uses of AI versus what are ethical controls that can be put into AIs, and those are two really very different conversations. But starting with the first one, how do you inform that body to make ethical choices around the use of AI?
Sorry, I was on mute, but question of the day, right, Steve? Yeah, full disclosure, I'm on that body. I helped create that body. So hopefully what answer I provide here is useful to the body and has been useful in the past. But, I think it's a lot of what we've all been talking about here. First of all, I think being honest and transparent about the fact that there is a problem. And to what Andrew was saying too, not forming a body, thinking that we can solve this with technical solutions, that, press cycles will overturn the next, ethical AI issue. This is simply just not an option anymore. And so I think that being honest from a corporate governance point of view and saying we need this body, we need to create it, we need to put some processes and governance in place was the first step. So I think just being honest and transparent about the problem, about the issues, and starting to ask, really, what can we do about this? And not just what we can do from a reactive or, marketing, legal point of view, what can we do from the beginning, from the build, from the technology development, process visualization, conception point, all the way through, the software development lifecycle, the data set intake process, our various privacy impact assessments, and then, governance and agreements with customers in terms of what our products and services can and cannot be used for in, licensing agreements, customer agreements, whatever we're doing. So I think it's really a holistic sort of all the way through approach to ethics. But like I said, from a responsibility point of view, right, rather than thinking about it in terms of ethics. So I think that answers your question for the technology build and development ask. But like I said, when it comes to the ethical uses, Intel I think is often most people would consider Intel an ingredient provider, right? We provide hardware components that are sold to customers all over the world and can be used for so many different things, in many cases in which we have no control and we can't track. And so I think one thing that Intel has done that I'm really proud of is actually going one step further to include in agreements with customers, these are specified misuses where we become aware of Intel products or services being used to violate human rights. We will stop business with that customer until we can gain high confidence that our products and services are no longer being used in a human rights violation or contributing to or linked to a human rights violation. And so, from a misuse point of view, I think that's something that we've done from a governance point of view to try to address some of these issues. But, like we've said on this panel, this is an ongoing dialogue. It's an ongoing conversation. I think the technology and ecosystem has become so complex, and just diversified, that it's really hard to tackle these issues with just corporate accountability and just corporate governance. And so, I think one other thing that hopefully Andrew and others on the panel will talk about as well is legislation, and the reality that we, I think, do need some we have emerging regulation in Europe, but in the US and I think all over the world, some more emerging governance mechanisms in privacy, data, and technology misuse, and the ways that technology can be used. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Chloe. And again, I'm familiar with the body that you helped create, and I think one of the really powerful things about it is the diversity of thought. So that is something that I think was really smart on that part, is that it's, as a big technology company, we do actually have lots of people who aren't by definition just technologists. And so having those diverse thoughts and also having an international flavor to that body, so it's not just US or US and Europe, it's a global group, helps at least get a more diverse result. And so Jim, I'm going to throw a hardball at you here real fast. So we talked about the need for some way of understanding how to implement ethical uses, and from what Chloe was discussing. But at the tactical level, what would be some examples of controls that you'd like to see built in to help guide ethical use of AI? What would be some of those actual implementation controls that you would recommend, or that you'd like to see more in development about?
So that's not an easier question, Steve. What we've been discussing is kind of what I would call the dimension of the responsibility for the creation, development, and adoption. I think so the word control has got a lot of associated meanings associated with it. So let's not talk about control, let's talk about accountability. So a specific element in ethical behavior is agency and accountability for that behavior. And so the notion of being able to, so that can guide policy in terms of defining responsibility, and when that responsibility is not followed in the manner that is consistent with a social construct, you have to have somebody who is accountable. And one of the areas that we've been looking at is to try to sort out who in an organization is actually accountable for a system that goes wrong. And let me give you one quick example. So in the circumstances where some of the vehicles that have been tested for the robotic automation, they've either injured people or run in and destroyed property and so forth and so on. It has been extremely difficult to understand who was actually accountable in those circumstances. Legally, and we've spoken to some law faculty about this, the law is not clear. And unfortunately, the way the law works is you have to have a lot of cases that are adjudicated, right? It's a procedural concept. It's not, it relates to ethical behavior, but law is the business of looking at consistent application of legal principles to a series of cases. This is what we don't want. We don't want a lot of cases of AI misbehaving. So we have to move this forward in some way, and I think Andrew and Tamara and others have described the question that you have to have policy, and I think a big element of that policy has to define accountability.
Absolutely. So Tamara, when we talk about the accountability, there is discussion about, well, who's accountable? And if you take a system, and I'm going to take the example we used earlier, if you take something like a Tesla, where there's a driver, there's the car builder, there's the software developer, there's the government that owns the roads and owns the infrastructure and applies the rules for what that car is going to be driving on. How do we start to think about who's accountable, and where do we start to implement those controls of AR? What is it purely the personal, the individual? Is it at the institution, at the government? I want to tease this out a little bit more, because I think this is an interesting area of a conversation around who's on the hook and who should be on the hook for implementing controls and making decisions based on the AI?
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty hard question, Steve. Thank you. Yeah, I feel like it really depends, but I do feel like it's important to have accountability throughout the whole chain, to make sure that, like, at the end of the day, even if a faulty technology was created, or even if a technology was created that was good, but maybe there was one like bug or something that caused this to happen. It's like, do you sue the developer because the developer left a bug in the code? I feel like that's really tough. I'm honestly not super sure, but what I can kind of think about is if we can find examples of, and kind of Steve, Jim, this gets back to your point of you need kind of repeated cases to make a case. So if we find like clear evidence that certain things are leading to like a bad outcome. So to draw on the Tesla example, like if we find that a specific turn on the road is causing a higher percentage of accidents to happen on that road compared to other roads, maybe it's worth addressing the road itself. It really just depends on kind of the situation. Yeah, that's pretty tough. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the different responsible individuals in the AI lifecycle, and start talking about because we're talking about in this panel is about how do we start thinking about ethical controls, whether they be practical implementations of technology to control the AI, or guidance, regulation, and policy. I think the key thing we sort of dancing around here is that it's going to take an ecosystem. It's going to take a community, both the ones that are the receiving end of the AI, the developers of the AI, the deployers of the AI, and the governing bodies upon which they live in. Is this going to be a social versus institutional battle? Can we have the two come together? Andrew, in your work with the UK government, how have you seen the government engage the community in some of these challenging questions around what is considered to be ethical controls or ethical uses? What is the balance that the UK government, or at least how you would think the UK would look at balancing individual versus institutional need?
So we're in a good position in some regards, in that we don't necessarily need much new legislation. And I agree with some comments earlier that case law is not necessarily the best way to implement things. You want policy that is clear, concise, and that is easily enactable, not for individual courts to decide on new things, preferably. Although obviously case law is a phenomenal resource and is very useful, ideally you want to solve problems before you get to that. Our regulatory landscape and our policy landscape is generally very broad, takes into account a large amount of input at each step, and we have some pretty great legislation. I can't speak to US legislation very much, but I can a bit to the UK, where we have we've got the Equality Act, we've got Human Rights Act, we've got Data Protection Act, and ways that kind of GDPR is written into UK legislation, which all kind of together produce something that's actually pretty reliable under most circumstances for how we enact AI and like different kinds of algorithmic decision making. The problem is that much of that legislation and much of that policy has to deal with new forms of technology or new forms of, say, discrimination. And although the legal clarity might be there in terms of what to do if someone is discriminated against, it might not be clear about how it works under new and different circumstances. And that's the point where having a lot of kind of convening a large number of people, kind of talking around how these new frontiers change and shift your interpretation or enactment of that policy is really important. And I'm really pleased to be able to say that one of my centre's core functions is convening a large number of voices to get good information and good advice around how these things change and how things should be implemented in the future. So we have independent legal counsel, we talk to developers, we talk to various companies in this space, we have kind of public listening exercises, and obviously we're an independent advisory board, so we're not beholden to government directly, but when we make recommendations, they do respond to us, and it allows us to approach conversations in ways that maybe other bodies in government might not be able to. So definitely we see that kind of regulation and regulators are key to this whole deal. But when a regulator shows up on your doorstep, sometimes you're not super keen to, divulge things. And when we show up, that's a slightly different conversation. So being able to convene a broad spectrum of people who are involved or invested in conversations and kind of boil down their opinions and ideas into something that is reliable and robust and would make good policy is something we're very invested in. There really are some truly fascinating kind of corners and avenues of how law applies or doesn't. And discrimination law is definitely one of them. So we have a thing in the UK called protected characteristics, which are not unlike the special characteristics in European law. And they are things like kind of age, disability, sexual orientation, marital status, so on and so forth. And we've got this really interesting conversation going at the moment where if you want to test your systems for bias, then you need to collect data about people to be able to do so. But you can't then have it in your process. So how do you make sure people trust you enough to give you that information? And how do you then use it responsibly? And we don't have clear methods and modes for that yet. So it'll be really interesting how we go forward. Does that involve data trusts? Do data trusts work? What are the things you need to jump over to get data trusts to work? There's economic, social, philosophical, legal, practical things that you need to deal with. But it's all fascinating.
Yeah. So Tamara, in some of your experience with trying to deal with lawmakers, what have you found as far as being able to get them information or get information out of them? You're on mute.
One of the things that we're doing right now is trying to kind of see if we can see any effects, like if people continuously produce biased news, what effects does that have on society or the economy or whatever. So as an example, if we look at biased headlines, we're doing some work right now with Bloomberg where we're looking at how causation bias in news headlines might drive stock prices. And if they do, and if that is demonstrated, and it's more than just a correlation, and it is something that is a meaningful and informative piece of information, how can we develop policies that will make it not okay for people to write such misleading headlines that might lead to manipulating the economy? And like, if you think about it, anytime Elon Musk tweets, it's like a joke. Like the whole world, like the markets move and things happen, and it's really crazy. But even if we had all of this information, who would we give it to make a policy that would change? Like, we don't have the systems in place that accept the data and accept the information from the private companies that then can be put into those rooms where the people actually decide on the law. So if we have lawmakers that are so disconnected from the technology space that they don't know, like Andrew, we don't have a you in for all of the different subfields of AI that people are building for. So it's really hard to communicate the insights that we are getting out in the real world back to the lawmakers so that they can make laws that can act based on those insights.
So it's like we need a cert just for AI. I wanted to get to a point that was made earlier in both Andrew and Chloe's comments and really get to a challenge, which is if we're going to start to implement and require ethics in the way we build and design AI and identify bias, I think we have to go to the beginning, which is how do we educate this current and next generation of students and developers and data scientists and AI architects? How would be the best way to educate them on ethics, on ethical controls, on proper use of AI? And so I'm going to pick on my university professor first, but I'm going to bounce this to everyone because I think this point is key. The workforce is where we got to start, because if they're not involved, they're ultimately the ones that are building those systems. So Jim, from a university's perspective, again, in the broader sense, how would you educate the next generation workforce on ethical AI and ethical controls?
So the question has a couple of parts, but in view of time and having everyone comment on this, the path is not well established right now. Basically, you basically have an issue of how you take a technical field and you socialize that field with other discipline knowledge that people will respect and incorporate in how they behave. And that notion is not one that we have done a lot of work with at the university. We've attempted to develop those type of things. We have curriculum development, but we're at an early stage in this, and I think I'm hoping that the panelists will agree. If you look at where the university funding is going, it is going to essentially cross-disciplinary type of activities. There's some large funding, more is needed. If you look at some of the traditional vehicles for how these things are funded, I'm in an organization that has a lot of government funding that funds AI activities. Is that funding multidisciplinary? It is not. The question then becomes, how do you build that into the mechanisms for training? The most effective training I think we do in the university is intern positions with companies and development of POC, proof of concept type of early stage development, which is reflected in both in Tamara's organization and I know in a lot of work that Intel has been doing. That's how you kind of get to it. You've got to get at the beginning of the cycle. So where would I put my colleagues at their intention to do that? I would place their interest very high. How responsive is the institutional system for crediting that work and valuing it in the academic context? I would say we have a ways to go.
So Chloe, at a corporate level, implementing policies for how our developers use and build AIs, what are some of the techniques that you've done in order, or have you seen Intel do, and I know some of them from being on the receiving end of them, to help engender ethical AI use and development?
Yeah, I'll be happy to talk about it. But first, I just really want to quickly piggyback off of what Jim said, with an anecdote. And I, first of all, totally agree with what he said about, sort of realigning some of these priorities from an academic and institutional point of view. What do we need to focus? What do we need to have our future designers and computer scientists, data scientists thinking about? When I was at UC Berkeley in 2014, there was only one. And this has changed, obviously, I think, in the industry, more classes on the social implications of computing or whatnot. But when I was at UC Berkeley in 2014, there was one class available for computer science students to learn about, the social implications of what they were building, what they were designing. It was one credit, it was optional, and it met once a week. So how many people do you think were in that class? Not very many. Yeah, they're not very many. Yeah, it was small. It was very small. I took it because this was the field of study that I was really interested in. But think about what the impact would be if we had a class like that, maybe 3 or 4. I don't know. I don't want to get crazy, but that was required of our computer science students, where instead of just relying on internships or corporate experience, part of their academic achievement and grading was dependent upon their ability to think about the ways in which their technology will impact society. Anyways, just had to provide that anecdote. But from a corporate point of view, Steve, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this too, as someone who's on the receiving end. I think just socializing the work that we're doing, right? Giving opportunities for people to get involved. This is in process now, but I think that we're working on translating some of the materials from our Responsible AI Ethics Council into corporate-wide training that will be taken for specific engineering groups and business units at Intel, but also incorporated into our company-wide code of conduct so that employees, where they think there is an ethical concern or have issues or concerns about something, but they're not really sure what to do about it, at least they have an avenue to figure out how to ameliorate that concern or address it. But I think really setting the tone from the top, our leadership has been very clear that this is an important issue. And so having people feel empowered in wanting to learn more about this, knowing how to, or feeling empowered in communicating about it, addressing concerns, thinking about ethics, all of that gets better and more pronounced when your leadership is invested in this issue. So more to come, but I think that, these types of trainings and just being transparent about what's important here is really, really critical.
Yeah. And I'll echo as one of the senior technical leaders at Intel. We were all brought in and given specific training on how to identify bias, how to understand how that bias introduces into data, even for those of us that are very familiar with the technology that it was being adopted, and to be able what to look for. And then we were also given training on how to work with our junior technical audience in order to be able to help them become better trained on using AI and identifying biases. And it was basically, they said, your job as a senior technical leader is to help shepherd the junior technical folks and those in your organization and across the organization. So we are definitely seeing that sort of tops down kind of approach. Tamara, as a small company that's got to stay nimble, but at the same time wanting to build an AI system that does right by the world, how have you inculcated that inside the mantras inside your organization with your small developer team to encourage them to get the product out the door, but to do it ethically?
Yeah, I feel like that's become just a core part of our corporate culture. Anybody who joins our team, it's the first thing that we start with. That's kind of the traits that we look for in candidates for positions are how transparent are they? What are their views on kind of transparency? But I feel like another thing that we try to do is kind of keep a close ear to our users. And I feel like working on technology solutions in a vacuum is very different than working on technology solutions in situ. And I feel like Camille really touched on this well. The user-centered design process really helps with being grounded in that design flow and actually making sure that you're building things that people need and want and are usable for people and meet people's standards. And so I feel like by constantly having that open channel of communication with the users, we're able to really understand what their privacy needs are and what ethics means to them and what the things that we need to do are to meet their standards. And whether that be like not tracking user data, like people want us to track everything that everybody scores and then get all of these insights about people, and that's not what we're interested in doing. And also our policies about like burning content that people run through VeriCrypt. Like, we're not keeping your content. If you're a news provider and you're running sensitive information, it's not our job to keep. So I feel like echoing kind of everything that's been said, it has to be the whole company, the whole ecosystem has to have this in the vision by design. From inception, this has been our vision and a core part of our mission. And I feel like that's really the only way to get it done. And as an early stage company, you always have the risk that like financial pressures in the future are going to push you to do things that are unethical. And that's really our biggest kind of concern. And it's something that we're super upfront with people about. We're not willing to sacrifice our values for the money. So that's kind of where we're at.
So Andrew, what can governments do, and not just the UK, but governments in general, do to help get that next generation workforce, whether it be the student body, get educated on ethical AI, or as many conversations right now in the US of the retraining of our workforce? What are some things that governments can do to help get that message out, or to inspire the next generation so that we get more courses in AI and ethics?
So first of all, I don't envy Jim at all in this. I think higher education is a very difficult spot for this whole deal. I think we ask an awful lot of researchers in specialist subjects before we ask them then to diversify into other subjects again. If you are going to be a successful researcher in a field, you need to understand an awful lot of things around your subject, not just the subject itself. So to then expect that to be 2 or 3 times over is a rough call. I feel like in the UK, and to a certain extent in the US as well, we have some really good centers of expertise that, rather than asking individuals to diversify, put people from different backgrounds right next to each other in ways that allow for this collegiate transfer of knowledge. And I think that's a really positive way of going about this, because rather than making sure that people have to specialize and specialize and specialize again, they can gain really deep knowledge in their field, but then have meaningful conversations and meaningful work with people who have deep knowledge in other fields. So I think that's a really positive move. The UK is kind of investing in pipeline diversity in subjects like STEM, which is really useful and really valuable. I think we have some really good champions. There's a couple of people who come immediately to mind for diversity in kind of in mathematics and computing subjects. And I think we are getting there. But there are places where we kind of need to identify where there are gaps, really kind of pull up our socks and get to work on tackling those gaps and put programs in place that will help fill those gaps. So yeah, I'm aware we're maybe a bit short on time, but short version, put smart people together with other smart people from different backgrounds and make sure that smart people can get the information they need to do good business in good fields.
Thank you, Andrew. And that's actually a good setup for the final section here before we transition. I want to give every one of our panelists 30 seconds to leave us with a parting thought on ethical AI and how do we get there. And I'm going to do a reverse order because I know, Tamara, you always get called last, so you're going to go first.
Okay, great. Just like parting words, take action. Don't just sit by and let what's happening happen. You have choices, you have tools, and people like me, but there's also people all over the world that are building tools for you to improve the way in which you relate to this ever increasing AI information system. So use the tools that you have and just stay open-minded, kind of as you go through it. Yeah. Other than that, if you're trying to read the news and be informed by it, check out VeriCrypt to see how biased it is before you make decisions that might affect your life or your emotional state.
Thank you. Jim?
Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So I'd like to echo a couple of the comments that have been made. I think when we reflect on this, I think the solution or the process that we have to have for AI is people. I don't think it's technology. And I think that we've talked about basically the human dimension here being the critical one. There's lots of technologies. There's going to be lots more technologies that are developed. The question becomes, to me, the question of who has agency and how those policies are directed. And I think the question then becomes, from where I sit and from where the colleagues that I speak with about this, we have to do a few very simple things. One, we definitely have to instruct ourselves. We are not ready. We need to know more. Two, we need to work with industry because the advancing knowledge curve in this area is in the industry. This is reflective of many technologies now. Industry is the one that's kind of bringing this together and advancing it. And three, echoing Andrew's comments, we have to work with government because government is in the is trying to identify the concept, and it differs by different traditions in the governmental authority, but we have to define what the public interest is here. And we have to define what the social construction is and what the social contract is. So I think those are the things that I'm trying to affect in my own institution. But I think everybody, including everybody listening to this program, who feels that these technologies are things they're directly concerned with, have to find agency in this discussion. And we're at an early stage.
Thank you, Jim. Andrew, what are some of your parting thoughts?
It's a big ask, isn't it? So I'd firstly echo, like Tamara, get involved. I'd echo Jim, like find ways to express your agency. But I'd add one thing on top of that, which is like this is the time, like the moment is now. And the reason for that is because we are very busy encoding a lot of ways we want the world to look like into systems that are, if not immutable, then certainly harder to change and have less nuance and have less context. And before we do that, we need to reflect on our practices and we need to identify biases that already exist. And we need to resolve not to carry them forward into those new systems. So before we even get to the AI bit of this argument, this conversation, we need to inspect the ethical part. We need to look at where our systems are racist or misogynistic, and do our best to identify the reasons for that, kind of address them as we can, and only then encode those decisions into systems going forward. If we can't do that, we're going to have to do it later. And Steve, as you said, it's much harder to do it after the fact than it was in the first place. So my leaving thought is the time is now.
Thank you. And Chloe, since you're at the beginning of the alphabet, you get to go last. What are your parting thoughts?
Well, that's a flip from the rest of my life, where I usually go first, especially in American public school. So, parting thoughts. I mean, I think I would like to echo what everyone said, but I think particularly something that I think Jim said in the chat, which was about accountability. We need to put in mechanisms to determine accountability now, right, for the future. And that needs to be iterated and worked out during the process, not at the end when there's a problem and we go, who's to blame, or how do we get remedy for this? How do we remedy this situation? And I think, the best way to address that is, like everyone has said, get involved, use your voice. I mean, I think we're in such a moment right now in the world. Camille talked a little bit about healthcare and the pandemic and how that's affected our lives. But I think, this is universal, or the lives of elderly people. But, this has dramatically changed all of our lives and the ways in which we interact with and trust technology. And I think that because of this global pandemic, we're really at a moment in which, things have happened so quickly. We've adopted new technology so fast. Here we are doing this panel online, and I don't know about y'all, but this is maybe the third or fourth Zoom webinar, work thing I've done in the last 24 hours just because of yesterday too, right? Everything is online now and being communicated digitally. And so now is the moment that we need to really think about, are we okay with the way that this is changing our lives, and what can we do about it? So I would just offer that up as well. And, like Tamara said, everyone has a voice, whether you're a part of, a company, a union, somebody who wants to get off Google or stop using Facebook, whatever it is, you have choices in your life and you do have agency. And I think, now is the moment to find out creative ways to exercise it. So once again, Steve, thank you so much. Thanks for your contributions throughout the entire session, and honestly for organizing all of this, all of these panelists and bringing us together. It's really been fun.
Thank you very much, Chloe. And I want to thank all of our panelists, Chloe Autio from Intel Corporation, Dr. Andrew Harding from the Center of Data Ethics Innovation for the UK Government, Dr. Jim Short from UCSD's San Diego Supercomputer Center, and Tamara Zubatiy from VeriCrypt. Thank you all for a fascinating show and for a fascinating panel discussion. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Karen and wish you all a good day.
Well, I'm just going to continue thanking people and start with Steve, because no one's thanked you yet for putting, or at least I haven't thanked you yet for putting together these amazing panels, and really one of the best discussions of AI that I've heard in quite a while, and really hit a lot of different areas of it. And I've mentioned this before on this show, but I also did undergrad at MIT, and at graduation I remember some people coming around and asking engineers who were graduating to sign a pledge saying, I think it might have been as simple as, I won't build weapons. I'm not going to work on weapons. But I like to, I've literally looked for this pledge to see, certainly nobody has held me to it. I can't find any evidence of it online. For all I know, it might have been, 10 people just walking around. But I remember it actually pretty often. And the way that it is lodged in my memory is as more of I will think about the ethical implications of the work I do and its actual effect on society. And it's really lovely to see so many people in this field where, whenever you get into a discussion of AI, you start to worry that all your engineer friends who are building amazing things are going to be the bad guys in someone else's story. And it's lovely to hear such, a description of the problem, but also the concrete ways in which, a lot of well-intentioned and very intelligent people are working on it. So thank you so much. I loved this, and I'm sure that, it was instructive both to people in the field and, outside of the field. So thank you so much to all of you. And with that, this was the AI and ethics episode of Essence of Wonder, with and sometimes without Gadi Evron. And you're all invited to hang around on Zoom, all the panelists, to chat with us afterward for a few minutes if you like. With that, thank you very much. Oh, I muted myself. Who are all of them? I think we're alone. It's just us. Our crew will start to come on. You guys were awesome.
Thank you guys.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Super.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining.